All right, welcome back to Overengineered, the podcast where we ask the question, what's the absolute best way to do things we have an already perfectly acceptable solution for? Today, I am here with Steve McDougall, and we're going to be talking a little bit about APIs. But before we get into it, Steve, do you want to do a quick introduction of yourself?
Yeah, hey, I'm Steve McDougall. Most people know me as just Steve King. I do APIs. I'm a developer advocate at a company called Treble, and I spend a lot of my time focusing on educational content.
Sweet. Well, this is fun. This is another episode where we kind of got connected through someone suggesting this on Twitter, and I don't know, this whole podcast for me is essentially just an excuse to like meet new people and talk about things that are interesting to me for longer than I usually have time to talk about those things.
It's a good
So this is kind
excuse.
of like, yeah, the excellent outcome of that. And yeah, I'm interested to see where this comes because before we decided to record, I was pretty upfront that like I'm not a huge believer in like going all in on APIs. So I think we're coming from very different perspectives.
We really are.
Um, and I think that's going to be interesting. And also we just discovered the look on your face when I said I wasn't a Vue guy. You
I know.
you looked
I was
surprised.
horrified.
Yeah, I don't know why. I mean, when we were deciding what sort of, you know, bigger stack we were going to use for when we needed to do really like sophisticated UIs, I think most of the decision just came down to there's more available in the React world. So certainly when we were deciding, there was just more available in the
Yeah,
React world. Um, pretty much any component that you need, someone's going to already have built like a really nice, accessible version of it.
yeah,
And at
100%.
the time, that wasn't as true for Vue, although I think that's changing now. Now
Yeah,
most
it's
things
come on
there's a
in
really
leaps
good
and
Vue.
bounds, actually. I've been
Yeah,
diving quite deep recently, and I've kind of stumbled over lots of hidden gems.
interesting. But yeah, I also have to say like the whole um the way Vue components are put together just never like fit with my brain. I don't know, I like JSX. I like the way it just I don't know. It's just XML and JavaScript. It's not you're not learning like v if and I don't know all these like special attributes and stuff.
Yeah,
It's funny because I know that's what makes it appealing to a lot of other people.
yeah,
So
no, 100%. It's kind of what drew me to it when I first started with Vue, because I mean, I used Vue when it was Alpha RC1 as a way to get away from
okay,
jQuery. So
hmm
I kind of jumped on it and stuck with it.
it's funny too because I love Alpine so much, and Alpine is effectively Vue Lite,
Yeah,
in a lot of ways. So it's funny that I say that the syntax doesn't appeal to me because when I'm writing Alpine code, I'm like, oh, this is the best thing. But I
it's all
think
about
for me,
context, right?
it is. It's very much about context. It's like Alpine, the syntax feels right because you're just kind of like sprinkling it into existing HTML. Whereas
Yeah.
if I need to build a really sophisticated UI, I feel like I go into a different mindset. Yeah, I definitely think that's true.
I mean, to be fair, I haven't built a sophisticated UI in so many years. So I'll leave that decision to people who actually know what they're doing.
Well, I don't know. Who knows if what I build is sophisticated, but it's something.
Most of the time, I
um,
build a form and a card, and I'm like, okay, I've done front end. I'm happy.
there you go. So yeah, you're all about APIs.
I am.
Um, and when you so like what's the intersection of that and your Laravel sort of experience? Is that mostly how you're implementing APIs, or do you do all sorts of different things, or I don't know, where does that play
Yeah,
out?
it really varies. I mean, I got into APIs through Slim PHP.
Okay.
implemented APIs in Laravel for so many years, but these days, if I'm building an API with Laravel, it's usually attached to an application.
Mhm.
If I'm building
Sure.
like a standalone API, I'm typically reaching for something like Golang or um, like Hono is another good one in the TypeScript world. I've used
Okay.
that
Yeah,
a
I'm
couple
not
of times
familiar with
now.
that.
Yeah, it's quite nice. Laravel, obviously, it's super powerful when you need to do more than just the basics. So
Mhm.
if I need an application that also needs an API, also needs an admin panel, then I'll go full in on something like the tool stack and add an API to it as well.
Okay. Um so you came in kind of guns blazing saying that you sort of get behind this idea that SPAs are still the way to go, that the push
Yes,
towards inertia or Livewire or just regular old Blade is not your preferred approach.
definitely.
And that is kind of astounding to me. So I'd love to hear more. Like let's hear your pitch.
I mean, I suppose I'm still stuck on the whole, the Jamstack was a huge thing for us in the industry, and I don't think we fully realised the potential of what the Jamstack could be. And these days, there's so many use cases and needs for an API that adding it as an afterthought always causes more frustrations than anything. So I like to build out my API, and then maybe I'll throw Nuxt on the front end. Then maybe I'll do a CLI. Maybe I'll do a mobile app or something. There's always extra tools that I'm adding to applications that I build to make using that product or that service a little bit easier. Whether that's a Raycast extension or a CLI tool, there's always a way that I want to add extra productivity boosts over just go to this web page and click these buttons.
Um and I mean, so when you say Jamstack, you're really just talking about like the JavaScript API. What is it? A JavaScript API markup?
Markdown,
Is that the M? Yeah.
Markdown. Although,
Oh, Markdown.
yeah, I'd probably say MDX over Markdown these days, just because you kind of want to add some level of components inside that Markdown as well sometimes.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we were just talking about this on a previous episode. This has kind of been the theme of the last couple episodes, and I've probably said this a couple times, but I'll say it again. I still totally buy the or I don't know, I still see the dream of like everything is JavaScript, right?
Yeah,
Because this is what I keep on coming back to, and this is kind of um a thing that I kept on coming back to when the whole sort of nonsense with Ryan Florence was going on a couple weeks ago. Is like, in the end, browsers run JavaScript, right?
yeah,
That is, and the browser is the constant that we all have to deal with.
yeah,
Um, so I totally get the appeal of a world where you're just writing JavaScript everywhere.
yeah.
Um,
And from a kind of a business perspective, like if JavaScript is running everywhere, the way that you're going to extend your capabilities is to plug into an API, either a third party or a self-hosted. And then from a yeah, I'm a developer advocate. I spend so much of my time creating content which is predominantly markdown. So for me, something like Jamstack still is still really useful.
sure. Yeah. I think something that one of my teammates and I were talking about yesterday, sort of just idly idly talking about the episode today, is and I think that this gets missed in the conversation a lot of times around these topics, is sort of team size and composition. I
Yeah,
think has a lot more to do with these decisions than we tend to acknowledge,
Massively.
because I think you know, a lot of the promise of sort of API first design um comes down to, you're going to be implementing different consumers of your API. Maybe you're doing a mobile app and a web
Yeah.
app, or you've got
Or
a
you've
big
got
enough
partners that are
team.
going to leverage your API. If you're
Yep.
building a
Yep.
developer tool, for example, you need an API and you need a good API. Otherwise, they're going to try. Everybody's had that experience where they've tried to work with an API, found it frustrating, and said, you know what, I'm going to go use this one instead because it's easier.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, anything that's where you're trying to work with developers, having good integrations is going to be a huge boon for
Yeah,
sure. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think that some of the conversation around like a lot of this stuff, both on the API side and on the JavaScript side, in the Laravel community specifically, comes down to I think a lot of Laravel developers, um, my impression is, or the folks that I interact with, um, it's a lot of small effective teams, right? It's like
yeah.
one, two, three people who are building or maintaining an entire product, right?
A lot of bootstrappers, basically, right?
a, a lot of bootstrappers, but also I think even when you get out of the bootstrapping phase, I mean, my organization's been around for 20 plus years,
Yeah,
and we still, and almost everything that we do is enabled by web technology of some sort. And
yeah.
we're still, a team of three developers, and I and only two of the developers are full time because I have lots of other responsibilities in the organization. Um, so, we're able to do that because um, of our approach in a lot of ways. Like if it was a couple of bigger siloed teams, we'd have to be thinking about it very differently,
Yeah,
but we wouldn't be able to be as nimble as we are, or I think as impactful as we are, uh, with that
definitely. And
approach.
I think
But it comes with trade
your
offs.
industry and your experience kind of dictates whether something like API first is going to be useful. It's not useful for everyone. It's super useful for those who need it, but for probably about 80% of the developers, they're probably not going to adopt API first because most of the time API is an afterthought for them.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that API first feels a little bit like I don't know. To me, it feels a little bit like um building for scale from the
Yeah,
beginning though. It's
yeah,
like so many developers get caught up in this idea of, oh, well, I need to make this work for a billion concurrent requests, right? It's
yeah.
like when you get to, 1,000 concurrent requests, you're going to have all sorts of other stuff that you need to sort out.
You got to worry
You'll
about other
figure it out when
things
you get there.
first, and your reinvention of the to do app isn't going to need that level of scale.
But it also feels to me, I think this is part of it for me, is like the API first mentality sometimes feels the same way. It's like, well, I need to build an API. I need to build and dog food an API because what if I build a mobile app, and what if we have third party integrations? And it's like, well, I don't
What
know.
you
When
don't,
you're ready to build a mobile app, the needs of that app in terms of the API it's going to consume, like you don't know what it's going to need yet,
yeah,
and you don't know what third party integrations are going to need. Like I get your point that it can feel like an afterthought, but I also think in a lot of ways, in my experience, if you try to optimize for those things early before you really have a use case for them, you end up just like spending a lot of time building something that ends up not being the right thing anyway. I don't know.
Yeah.
Do you think that's at all
No,
true in your experience?
totally agree. I mean, there's been so many times when I've built an API and then went to use it with something afterwards. It all just felt wrong, and I
Right.
wanted to use someone else's API instead of my own. So it was one of those, you know, certain situations API first is absolutely great, but 80% of the people they won't need it, they won't want it, they won't benefit from it. It
Yeah.
works well at that enterprise level where you've got, so many different teams all wanting to integrate with the same API, whether that's a web team, the Android team, the iOS team, some other team that also needs to integrate with that service. The API first in those situations makes the most sense.
Yeah.
But I still don't design my APIs using an open API spec. I generate my open API spec once I've built my API.
Hmm. Um, it almost feels to me like it's kind of similar to TDD almost. Like for me,
Yeah,
TDD can be incredible. I mean, I've had just like amazing sort of mind-blowing development sessions where I'm just like I wrote out all these tests and then I'm just getting them green and everything's perfect.
so
But
I go for something what I call TPD, which is test proven development. A totally made up phrase where, because half the time when I'm writing tests, I have no idea what I want the code to actually do. So
right.
I end up writing the code, then writing tests, and then tweaking and refactoring.
Well, and that feels kind of similar to the API stuff in that if you're really confident in what you need the outcome to be, writing the test first can be really, really, really useful.
Yeah,
And it feels like it would be similar with the API stuff. If you're
yeah,
really confident in what consuming this API is going to feel like, then um, you know, build build that, right? And go
yeah,
with it.
100%. I mean, a lot of the time
But
when
if
I
you
design
don't,
an API, I kind of integrate with it while I'm building it so that I can feel the frustrations of the API as I'm building it so I can act on it a lot quicker. And that might be through some HTTP client, or it might be through, a Raycast extension that I just throw together just so that I can test it depending on
mhm,
the implementation need. But I do try my best to, approach it like I would tests because you can draw a lot of parallels.
yeah. Yeah, although that's always tricky because the, years ago we integrated with this it was a it doesn't matter. We integrated with this API that was clearly someone built it with this like principle of like build the API, dog food your own API, that they were building their API and building the primary UI for this tool hand in hand.
Yeah,
And the thing that was so awful about it was all it meant was that the API ended up being 100% coupled to their specific use case.
yeah,
I mean, even down to the naming of the inputs and outputs matching the names of the fields in their UI.
yeah,
Um, and so it's like that's a great idea. Consume your API as you're building it, unless it ends up meaning that you just build an API that's custom tailored to just your one specific use case.
yeah. I mean, I actually spoke about that in when I spoke at Laracon EU in Portugal. You know, APIs need to be designed for the purpose, not it's not a one size fits all with an API. You might have an internal API, and then you have external parts to the API or admin aspects to the API. So you really need to kind of design the API that you need, not just build these kind of CRUD interfaces and call it an API. Because a lot of
Right.
the time you're building those out based on your needs, not the person who's going to use your API.
So, but it sounds to me like all this aside, your take is, you know, if you got to pick, you would write out an API and then build an SPA if you were starting from something
100%.
from scratch today.
Yeah, I
So
mean, yeah.
what about that, what about that really appeals to you, and what do you think are some of the major benefits of that approach in this sort of in this day and age?
So, I mean, I'll talk about it from the kind of opposite end. Like a lot of the time, I'll build a live wire tool stack application, and I hit a point in the development where I've got to start trying to be overly creative to try and get the UI to do things that I want it to do
Mm-hmm.
because we don't have JavaScript. And
Sure.
then okay, so I use Alpine, but then I'm ending up writing lots of JavaScript that is usually badly written by myself, but it's not organized, it's not componentized, it's not benefiting from the newer JavaScript ecosystem. So
Mm-hmm.
okay, I go over and I try inertia, and then that's all great, and I get a couple of steps more, closer to where I want to be with my application, but then I'm missing all of the modern front end tooling that could also benefit my application. So if I go straight
Can you
for an API and go
Wait, can you give an
for
example of that? I'm not quite sure I follow on the
yeah, like
tooling piece.
monorepos and Nuxt, for example, there's Nuxt layers, there's Nuxt
Okay.
modules. And then if you're kind of looking outside of Nuxt, you've got things like Learner for the
Mm.
like the
Okay. Sure.
monorepo builds where you can have component libraries and applications that are kind of all baked into that one repo with that more mature front end tooling, which allows you to, work with each component in isolation as well as within the context of the application. So
Mm-hmm.
by adopting an API and adopting something like Nuxt with Nuxt layers or monorepo approach, you're getting the best of both worlds because your front end tooling is the best it can be, and then your back end tooling is also the best it can be because where PHP really shines is with database interactions with that stateless request response lifecycle. So you're kind of getting the best of both worlds at that point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I can see, the moment that you have sort of multiple sophisticated interactions that are all sort of layered on top of each other inside of a page, that definitely is where uh the Livewire or inertia approach gets a little bit trickier because they tend to be like full component level, full page
Yeah.
level. Although I know that that's not 100% true of Livewire, but I'm not super fluent in building anything super sophisticated in Livewire, so I don't know for sure.
Yeah. I mean,
Um,
I've tried to build some pretty complicated things in Livewire, and you know, that was mainly Livewire too. And there was always some form of kind of compromise that I had to make to achieve what I needed to. And again, the same thing with inertia, but that's because I'm trying to do it within the context of a Laravel application at that point. I'm not able to
mhm,
benefit from this tool or that tool or this new thing that the React team have just released. That's only focusing on Next and Vercel because that's kind of like the front end feeding ground now. So
right.
you're missing out on a lot of potential great bits of tooling that you could use by trying to smush these two things together when you could benefit from just letting them be good at what they're actually good at.
So what's your take on I feel like the two other approaches in the JavaScript world are either um GraphQL or, recently you got React Server Components, you've got more I think a bunch of different interesting approaches, before server components Vercel had a version of, server executed code that
Yeah.
sat inside of the component. I know that Remix has that same concept as well, where you're kind of in that case, you're kind of blurring the line between the client and the server, and
Yeah.
there's not really this API layer so much. And then, in the GraphQL side, it's just a different approach to querying and passing information around.
Yeah. So I mean, from a server component perspective, I mean, the way that I've always seen JavaScript on the server is just like someone's written a HTTP server in jQuery, and it just instantly makes me shudder. Um, I know that's not the case, but it just feels like we're trying too hard to get JavaScript to run everywhere that we haven't stopped to ask ourselves, should it? Um, yeah, but and I suppose with GraphQL, like it was designed at Facebook to fit a very specific problem 10 to 15 years ago when 3G was the fastest we had, and we were worrying about, you know, other things in the technical industry. And, now, we've got 5G in a lot of places, 4G. I mean, I'm in rural Wales, so, I don't have the fastest internet connection in the world.
Hmm.
But I still get 4G in most places. And then there's HTTP 2 and HTTP 3, which means that we've got bidirectional transport, which means that the problems that GraphQL was designed to kind of overcome don't exist anymore. The only real application is that people can be a little bit more choosy on the data that they want back specifically. But JSON API spec also allows that through REST. So it's, there's certain situations where GraphQL is the right choice.
Sure.
There's not
Yeah.
many
I mean,
across where I've thought this would really benefit from GraphQL.
that's my take as well. I mean, I remember when GraphQL first started to gain popularity. I got why everyone was excited about it. It felt like a really interesting, expressive way to ask for data from the server.
Yeah,
And, the idea of sort of just saying exactly what you need and letting the server take care of that is very appealing. Um, and I think it solves some interesting problems sometimes
yeah,
around versioning and deprecating data and stuff like that, because
yeah,
you have a little bit more flexibility to just say, yeah, both ways are fine, until no
yeah,
one's using the old way, we'll just keep it around because we can just have the new way and it's fine. um,
definitely.
which obviously other API approaches you can do, but I think GraphQL
Yeah,
tends to make that
GraphQL
better.
really got it right when they introduced things like deprecated and things like that. I definitely think that works well, but to put it in as blunt a way as a British person could do, it just feels like I'm programmatically filling in an advanced search form field to ask for something from an API.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's
Advanced
that's
search over HTTP.
that's basically what I was getting to. Is I get all of that, and there are good things, but every time I have to consume a GraphQL API now, I just shudder.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, especially if you're not dealing with GraphQL in JavaScript, where
Yes.
the SDKs and sort of developer tools are there. Consuming a REST API in any language is basically easy and supported, right?
Yeah.
But maybe to a fault, I don't know, but I am certainly just an absolute slave to my IDE in terms of syntax highlighting and
Oh,
autocomplete.
so am I. Like
And
I can't do anything if I'm not in PHP Storm.
Right. Yeah. And PHP Storm has great GraphQL support, but it doesn't. Uh, there isn't sort of like a canonical way to do GraphQL queries in PHP.
No,
So, you're not getting inline syntax highlighting unless you write all your queries in separate GraphQL files and then
and
like
then
load
copy and
those
paste them or
files.
load them in or something. Yeah,
Yeah,
it never feels like a complete picture.
yeah, 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 and it just doesn't feel like it was made for anything but that one use case.
Yeah,
Um, so I mean, and I think the world has moved on for the most part. I mean, there's some very popular tools that still use it. I know that GitHub's primary API is GraphQL. I know Linear's
yeah,
API is GraphQL. Like there are lots of very big, successful, effective tools that use GraphQL. Um, but you don't see it uh, as the first choice everywhere all the time like it
no.
was a few years
I'm
ago.
seeing a lot more people adopting like TRPC over GraphQL these days.
Hmm. Yeah, I've seen a lot of conversation around new RPC protocols, but I'm not familiar with them at all. So what is TRPC?
It is basically just TypeScript remote procedural calls, I believe. It's like gRPC for TypeScript. It's
Okay.
it makes a lot of sense if you're in a microservices space, but if you're not, then you're just adding lots of tooling and build steps to join in with the cool kids.
Sure. I mean, it's interesting because, RPC, the principle between RPC behind RPC, um, that appeals to me the most is it's essentially just another function call, or it feels like another function call, right? You're just there just happens to be a network in between you and the
Yeah,
function call. um but it's interesting because uh sometimes having that much flexibility is actually a problem, right? In terms of consistency and sort of knowing where things are. And
yeah,
that's a complaint that I have about GraphQL as well. Um, it's just like, with REST, there are very specific conventions that almost everyone agrees about, right?
yeah.
In terms of thinking about things as resources, and we have specific verbs that we
There's
use
REST
to deal with those
principles for a reason, right?
resources. Yeah. Um, and when you get back to, RPC, we've had this idea for ages. Like, how many people have had to deal with like a SOAP, a SOAP API back in the day, right? It's the
Yeah,
same idea. Um,
just reimagined
you,
by Google.
huh?
Just reimagined by Google.
Right, right. But it's like, that level of flexibility just means that everyone can do it differently,
Yeah,
which is not necessarily great.
yeah.
Um,
It definitely throws a spanner in the works if you know as soon as you need more than just yourself to use it.
right. Um, yeah, I think that I think that I'm trying to remember. It's Adam Wathan who did um the Laracon talk years ago about the I think I could be getting this wrong, but sort of there was a really sort of central talk in the Laravel community about um embracing those sort of restful, cruddy um design ideas just across your application.
Yeah,
Um and it really did come back to just like that idea of, if everyone follows these same basic conventions, then when you come back to your code 5 years later, or when a new developer who's familiar with the conventions comes in, it's easier to find things.
yeah,
And I think that that's another one of those ideas that really is dependent on the size and composition of your team, because
Yeah,
if
definitely.
you're working on your own little thing, who cares? Do
You
whatever you
do what
want.
you want to do because you're only affecting yourself. And
Yeah.
I think a lot of my kind of opinions and approaches, they kind of built up over time based on me just being a developer, just like everyone else. We grow our own opinions, but I've been an engineering manager and an engineering kind of technical leader for quite a while, and onboarding new team members, acquiring products and taking that into a team, you see a lot of pain points in the kind of day to
Yeah.
day development workflow. And you start to kind of get really picky about it. Okay, this is how we write code. This is why we write code this way. Here's 12 pages on Notion why we write code this way. You start to kind of obsess over it, I guess. But once you've kind of seen the pain of a larger team, you kind of just get stuck in that way of, okay, I've got to write it this way because if I ever hire someone to do it, or if I come back to it in 5 years, I want to make sure that it's all done in this nice square box that I understand as this is how code works.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of value to that. Um, and it's, I think it's a lesson. I think you're right. It's a lesson everyone kind of learns in their own way. And you kind of decide how to prioritize that in different ways, whether it's, you know, code standards, or embracing tooling that kind of enforces different rules, or,
Yeah.
um, yeah, there's a lot there. I actually think I might be recording an episode on like custom linters for
Nice.
projects, because a whole other thing.
Yeah, I worked on somewhere. I used to work at a Laravel partner. I was the engineering manager at Jump 24, one of the UK
Okay.
partners, and they had like they've got two or three different open source packages solely focused to their coding standards. Because
Mm-hmm.
in that agency world where you're jumping from project to project, and you know when you're a Laravel partner, you've got a certain level of quality that you've got to keep. So
Yeah.
like documenting and automating parts of that makes a lot of sense. So
Yeah, for sure.
yeah,
And I mean, when you're working with other developers, um, you know, the last thing that I want to waste anyone's time with is like a code review that's just like, oh, this is fine, but it's not how we do it. You
oh, that's
know,
not quite
like,
PSR 12. Please change this.
yeah, yeah. I
Yeah,
mean, yeah. Huh.
I mean,
So
I'm
do
a
you
huge
have,
fan of I use a PER standard, not PSR 12,
okay.
newer version, but you know, I'm a huge fan of tooling to achieve that. The amount of
Yes, for
time
sure.
in my career where I've had PRs, oh, could you add an extra space here, or that should be on a new line, or it's just like that's just wasted so long. And as soon as you introduce like CI testing as well, okay, you're gonna make me waste 45 minutes potentially on a larger application for all the tests to run to make sure it passes, to then say I'd prefer if you you know wrote this
Put this
statement,
on a new line.
yeah, put this on a new line or something pretty ridiculous. you know
Yeah.
it starts to get a little bit crazy, and then your
So,
productivity dips. And okay, I've managed to push code up 4 times today, but it's all been for the same PR to try and appease some invisible standards that weren't documented, or there's no automated testing.
yeah. Yeah, for sure.
I
Um,
think everyone's felt that pain.
I think everyone has, anyone who's worked at a team with multiple people,
Yes.
and somebody has opinions, right? Which is most places.
Yeah.
Um, Going back to the API stuff, I did wonder, um, you know, when you think about API design, are there any um, are there any hard and fast rules that you just always follow that you're just like, this is something that I don't care what it is I'm building, I don't care who it is that's going to use it. This is how it's done, and what comes to mind for me is things like versioning, authentication, standard response formats. I don't know if there's
Yeah.
anything
Yeah,
else
I
like
mean,
that.
I kind of have like a playbook, I guess. I don't actually version my APIs.
Okay.
Um, there's a huge that's probably a whole other podcast episode. Something that I did version my APIs for such a long time, and Phil Sturgeon kind of showed me the light of why I don't need to, and now I don't.
Okay, I
Well, I
want to
know
get back to that.
that.
I'm very interested, but if you have other things, we'll come back to it. I won't
Yeah,
forget.
no, I can drop you a link on that one. Phil Sturgeon wrote a blog for where I work about API versioning and why you don't need it.
All right,
um,
what's the short version?
the short version is that HTTP, they've introduced new RFCs for things like the sunset headers. So your
Okay,
tooling should be able to pick that up these days so that you can mark an endpoint as deprecated, or you can mark things as deprecating using HTTP headers.
interesting. How does that work on the consuming side?
I suppose, like, if you're consuming an API, I don't know. Like, I'm assuming you need to be using some form of official SDK, really,
Hmm.
for the whole big picture to work nicely. But if you're doing kind of, uh, you know, a thrown together integration, then I suppose monitoring is the only way to keep an eye on that.
Hmm. Yeah, it just I think there's two ends of the spectrum. There's like
Yeah,
we're going to improve our API and sunset features, and you just have to get with it.
yeah,
Is one side, and then there's like the Stripe side of we're going to support every version of our API that's ever
yeah,
existed for all of time,
yeah. It's
and
crazy, absolutely crazy.
it's
Okay, so
wild.
I've actually got
Yes.
a question for you this time.
Okay.
When's the last time that you built an API, versioned it, and had to change the version? Or do you always get V1, stick on it until you make a mistake and go to V2?
Uh, yeah. I mean, I think it tends to be there's V1, and then at a certain point, you need to change the shape of a request or a response significantly. So you copy the entire thing into V2 and make that
Yeah,
change. And then you get there, and a while later you need to change the shape of something again, and you copy it all over to a V3. Um, I in an ideal world, um, I would be using something that does some sort of schema transformation like Stripe does, where you can
yeah,
support everything with just the latest API. That hasn't been the case. But we certainly have had to release new versions, but it usually is exactly that. It's like and I say we copy everything over, right? We don't. Like, it just falls through to um whatever the most recent implementation that matches that version is.
yeah,
Um but we're on V3, V4 of a couple of the APIs that we publish for partners. Um and I think for me the value there is um the cost of integrating is not it's not free. And if the existing API works for somebody, but doesn't work for new use cases, as long as maintaining both of them isn't a huge burden, I'd
Yeah.
rather just offer both, you know?
Yeah. I definitely think there's something to be said about that transforming layer. And it's something that I've been toying with for a while. Is building a package that allows me to do Stripe style kind of versioning on the data, so that I can
Yeah.
transform any data going out and coming in to kind of marked built versions. So I can say, okay,
Mhm.
so version X is this, and I just detect from the header and just pass it off to a package that just does it for me.
Yeah, that would be very cool. We do a version of that for some internal data, where the schema has changed over time. Um and essentially anytime it's like these objects are fetched from the database, we just look at what the schema version is and migrate it to the latest on the
Yeah,
fly rather than having to migrate all the data at once. Um and for the most part, it's not that hard of a problem to solve, right? You're essentially just
yeah,
passing it through like a middleware stack, right?
basically, yeah,
um the only real challenge is effectively, um you have to account for data be not existing always, like forever,
yeah,
in the implementation of your API. Like you always have to account for, well, 5 years ago this field did not exist, and therefore even if the new API like implementation requires it, if it's coming through the old version, there's still a chance it's going to be null.
yeah,
um and that's something to just wrap your head around. But um, I'm already kind of bought into that way of thinking because of dealing with event sourcing, where
yeah,
essentially you're in a place where that data just exists as it existed at the time, and that's just the end of it. So once you wrap your head around that, I don't think it's that hard. I think it'd be very cool for someone to have like a really solid, um, a solid system that felt like middleware, that
yes.
just worked really nicely within a Laravel application.
Yeah, the
I
the
encourage you
hardest
to
part that I
follow through.
found is matching the developer experience to a point where it feels worth doing.
Okay. The developer experience in terms of the
In terms of
API
just
developer or the like integration
just
developer?
Laravel in general, just when I'm building something with
Mhm.
Laravel, my kind of a standard that I aim towards is that I want this to feel like it belongs as part of Laravel. So
Yeah,
anything that
for
I
sure.
build as a package, like if it doesn't feel like Taylor or one of the team could have wrote it, then I've still got some work to do on that.
Sure. Yeah.
Probably an impossible standard to hold myself to, but it's one of those things that you just can't help sometimes.
Um, do you think, I mean, I can see like two potential approaches. One would be essentially like migrations, right? You'd have
Yeah,
a parent class that has an up and a down,
yeah,
and the up just takes data in the format of the previous version and returns data in the format of that version. Um, and down would be the opposite, right?
yeah,
Takes the response from the server in the current format and turns it into the response that would have existed for the prior format. Um, or there's the middleware approach where it's sort of a single object that it receives the data and the callable for what to do with it next. And
yeah,
then,
exactly.
you have both sides of it in one implementation. I don't know.
It's an
Do you,
interesting problem to solve, and I don't know if there's a right or wrong way to solve it, if I'm honest. I've been
yeah.
dabbling with it for about 6 or 7 months, and I've still not made up my mind.
Mhm. So if you were to do versions, do you think that goes in the URL? Do you think that goes in a header? Do you think that goes in a query parameter? Where do you think that belongs?
I think If it's a REST API, I think it belongs in the URL because the URL is built up as RESTful resources. So, you want to go to a specific version of it, or a sub resource of a resource. Everything's kind of directed based on the URL path. So,
Mm-hmm.
for versioning in a REST API, I think it belongs in that URL.
And so, do you think that that means that that it shouldn't be transparent to the developer either? Like, because I can imagine, I've tinkered with both versioning routes and doing like localization of routes, where essentially, you introduce middleware that parses out that like first prefix of the path and
Yeah,
then replaces it so that the rest of the application doesn't even see that there was like a V1 at the beginning or a en-us or whatever at the beginning. All it sees is the final, like the path that extends that, and there's some sort of global context that becomes available that's like, this request is for, Canadian, French Canadian, or this request is for version 3, but
yeah.
that the
I
routing
like to
kind
be
of.
very direct with that. It's a strong decision. I in my code, I will the namespace matches like the URL path for a v3 or a v2, and then
Mhm.
I have controllers that are v3 controllers or controllers that would be a v2 controller, for example.
Mhm.
And it means that yes, your application's kind of growing over time, but if you're kind of monitoring and observing your API, you know when you can deprecate things.
Sure. But I guess if there was some sort of layer that does this transformation for you, effectively your application no longer has to have an understanding of the version, right? It only cares about the latest version
Yeah, exactly. I
and
only care about
that
the latest
transformation
version,
layer.
and I have some level of kind of have some kind of, I suppose, request factory methods that will go, okay, so you're sending this to me in version 1.0.0, and I'm currently operating on 1.2.0, so I'm just going to, transform the data before passing it through the kind of validation. So it all happens in that middleware layer based off of
Yeah.
that header.
Yeah. And in that case, you think it would make sense for it to be a header.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, I can see that. I can see that. And I think that's how Stripe does it,
Yeah,
right? It's all a header. Yeah.
yeah. It all done through a header. And I believe parts of Amazon do it, or at least their SDKs do. Um,
Mhm.
I, some of the larger organizations will do it that way.
Yeah. And do you think the like V1, V2, V3 approach makes sense, or do you think the like, both of those examples, Stripe and AWS, it's like the, you know, 2024-01-01 API or whatever, it's pinned to the date that it was released.
Yeah.
Um, do you have any preference there?
Um, I don't think I've formed an opinion on that yet. To be honest, I
Yeah.
think it depends on the company itself. Like if it's a large company like Stripe, they're going to build up for a release candidate, so they're going to have a version number based on that specific release. And
Yeah.
a smaller company that's 2 or 3 developers, your release candidate is I'm off tomorrow, so I'm going to release today. There's no massive build up, right?
Right. Yeah. I've always gone back and forth on it because I find that the discoverability of the API versions when they're just a date is worse, right?
Yeah,
Um, we're dealing with this right now with Stripe, where it's like, there's the version that we were working against, and then there's the latest version, and it's just like understanding how big of a gap there is between the two of them
Yeah,
is not obvious. It's like, it are these one version apart and they just didn't release a new version for 14 months or
yeah.
whatever,
The
or are
date
there
thing,
30
it's
versions between the two?
yeah. The date things never made sense to me. I mean, I get the approach. It's like their internal build number.
Yeah.
So it was built on this date, so that's the version number. But you know, I'd rather have to remember, okay, so I'm on build 1.23.45. Okay, great. I know I'm on that one. Instead of what
Mhm.
date did I release that? It's a little bit easier to remember.
Right. Right. That's interesting. I didn't even think of uh yeah, you could essentially use like semantic versioning for your API version.
Yeah,
Um because there are some changes that are purely additive that don't require um aren't a breaking change. They don't necessarily need a
yeah.
new version release, but there's something interesting about saying, "Oh, this is a 1.2.5
The minor fix
release."
to the API.
Yeah, yeah, that's cool.
It,
I like that.
it's
So
definitely something I've looked into.
yeah, other than versioning, are there other things that sort of just principles that apply to all API design that you've developed opinions about?
Yeah, all APIs should be authenticated in my eyes.
Hmm.
Even if it's a read-only public API, you still want to authenticate because you want to be able to, block API tokens if there's abuse, or you want to be able to kind of track user behavior to see if anyone's exceeding terms and conditions.
Hmm.
Um, then obviously there's authorization on top of that, which is kind of like a no-brainer, I guess. Pagination, 100% need pagination on an API. Um,
And you
you're
think
sending
every response should be paginated, whether there's, you
collection
always
collection
expect there to be.
responses only. I If it's like a collection response, like you're getting a list of objects, then you paginate it. Otherwise, don't. Because the problem with not doing it is, if you're going to then adopt something like JSON API, for example, as a standard, and you want to be able to optionally include sub resources, how far down the rabbit hole do you want to go? Because they could go 7 levels deep on each relationship, and originally your payload size was maybe 32 kilobytes. You've included 7 relationships, and suddenly your payload's too large. You're getting the wrong response back from the server, and things aren't working. Because a lot
Sure.
of the time people won't stream the response; they'll just return the response and give it you back.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. It's like, it makes me think of the, going back to GraphQL, if you're using relay, the nodes and edges and cursors and all that stuff,
Yeah,
like it does add a little bit more noise to an API when things are really simple. It's like,
yeah,
you know, I'm I'm only ever going to get 3 of these back. Why does it have to have all this pagination information? But
yeah,
being consistent from the get-go with that, I totally buy. Then you're never in a position where you have to change it down the road because suddenly there's more stuff than you expected.
yeah. Exactly. I mean, sometimes depending on your API, just a simple limit and offset kind of pagination works. Um,
Mhm.
Other times you want cursor pagination. Other times you just want page navigation. All of that depends on what API you're building, what the endpoints are, what's the purpose of them, and you know, it's what I call kind of like the API journey. You've got like user journeys on the front end. I think heavily around kind of the API journeys. What is the developer trying to do when they come to this endpoint. How can I make their job easier? What can I give them? What can I also include so that we don't have to make subsequent requests? It's all very contextual at that point.
So
Um,
you don't have like an opinion that it should just always be cursor based so that that decision is just always made.
no, it massively depends on the purpose of your API. In my eyes,
Yeah.
some some APIs will benefit from different approaches depending on their need and the use case.
Yeah, for sure. So when
Um,
you say authentication and authorization, do you think like OAuth is just always the way to go and token based permissions?
no, I mean, I'm still happy to throw a JWT token out. Um,
Mhm.
but for me, if I'm building a Laravel API, I'll just go straight for Sanctum, and I'm happy. There's times
Mhm.
where I'll need to reach for OAuth, but not many.
Okay.
There's really not that many times. I mean, unless you need the full weight of what OAuth offers, simple API token auth through something like Laravel Sanctum is more than enough.
And Sanctum is just like a bearer token. Is that
Yeah,
then all it
it's
is?
basically is a little bit like JWT, but a bit better.
Okay. Interesting. That's interesting. Yeah, I would have thought. I mean, and this speaks to my sort of uh, lack of experience in this space because I just don't deal with API design very often or consuming APIs or building APIs that need to be consumed by other people. Um, so I would have just assumed that sort of like OAuth 2 was just like the standard now, but that's interesting that you say it's not. Like,
Yeah, it's
um,
like, I mean, we at Treble where I work, we've consumed billions upon billions of API requests because we're an observability platform, and the vast majority aren't using any sort of OAuth.
okay. Huh. Yeah, that's
And
fascinating.
yeah, we released a really interesting report a few months ago. The most popular day to send an API request is a Wednesday, and the most popular place to send an API request from is Richmond, Virginia.
I guess is that where AWS US East 1 is? Is
I'm
that
assuming so, yeah.
that makes sense, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, I guess that's just like I would have never thought of that, but that's an interesting point. I bet you, yeah, where the major data centers are is going to
yeah.
drive so much of the
Apparently, people do a lot of data synchronization on Wednesdays from Virginia. That's all I know.
right. That's so funny. Is there anything else that comes to mind in terms of just like, you know, uh things that you just always want to tick off the box when you're
Yeah,
first implementing?
cash, cash, cash,
Okay.
cash, cash, cache everything. And I'm not talking about like
Okay.
just throwing sparsely used response cache because that's not always enough. You know, you want to have a good cache strategy for the data, and then add the correct cache headers. Is this
Yeah.
public? Is it private? What's the age of a cache? And you know, adding an e tag can
Yep.
massively reduce that response time. Also, like idempotency. Do you need it on your API? What is the kind of potential side effect of someone sending that API request twice? What's
Sure.
is it going to? Yeah, it makes sense a lot in payments. You don't want to end up double paying for something, but in other implementations, does it make sense to also add it? Does it not? Where's the right place to put that? And I suppose they're the things that I always consider when I'm building an API.
Yeah, I mean getting caching right is such a hard
Yeah,
such a hard thing and I this is a little bit of a pet peeve of mine. I think um cache headers uh, are just like such. I mean, I was gonna say low hanging fruit, but it's not exactly low hanging fruit because it should be simple, but it's not at all because the browser implementation of headers of how caching is done has changed so much over the years that I feel like the resources out there for what the best practices
Yeah,
um are so inconsistent. Like what do you use cache control? Do you use um you know last modified if like all these different the pragma no cache all these different ways of telling the either telling the server this is what I'm looking for or telling the client this is what I know about this thing
yeah.
um
The
it's so
standards have changed
tricky.
so much over the years. I think there's definitely space for some educational content around that. I think you've given
I
me an idea
agree.
of some content to write on my flight this weekend.
There you go. Well, here I will say um the distinction between weak what a weak e-tag is. I think that that's like one of those things that you let alone just wrapping your head around e-tags and then it's like, oh well, if you pass the e-tag incorrectly, like it might actually not be interpreted the way you
Yeah,
intended. And then the other one that I think is always interesting is like the shared headers versus the private headers, right? Like
yeah,
being able to tell intermediate proxies one thing and tell the browser another thing. There's
yeah,
so much there that can be really, really powerful and
yeah,
improve response times tremendously.
yeah. No,
Um,
optimizing your API requests, there's so much that you can do, and
yeah.
if you can configure your Cloudflare kind of CDN, but then you can also configure your API itself, and then you could also configure, from my perspective, a Jamstack application. You could start to use like cached requests on the front end. So there's so much you can do to squeeze out that extra performance.
hmm Yeah. I mean, um, and that's a whole other thing that you see pretty commonly on the uh SPA side is things like SWR, right?
Yeah,
Stale wall revalidate, or you know, there's that same sort of there's the whole class of cache control headers around. What do you do if it's stale? What do you do if it's if the server's not responding? Like, can you
yeah,
use something that's expired if you can't talk to the server yet?
yeah.
Um, and
And
that
again, all that
can,
boils back down to context and purpose. You know, is the experience of your application going to be massively impacted if the server goes offline? If it does, then do you want to go for that stale data?
yep,
Is something
yep,
going potentially going to go wrong if they use that stale data? You know, if you're building a to-do app, yeah, definitely not. If you're building banking, then okay, you really need to be careful with that one.
yeah. You need to understand what the implications are.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, I remember I went deep down this rabbit hole at one point, and I just pulled up my notes because I there was one that I was curious about, which is the expires header versus the max age header.
yeah,
Um, I'm always like, which one is it? And my note here says cache control max age is better, that you should just always use that.
yeah.
But I feel like I recently ran into something that was making the argument that the expires header was actually just easier to deal with. So
Like, I mean,
it can be so
if you're
frustrating.
getting data from an API, you want to know how long that data is going to be valid for at some point, right? Certain
Yep.
applications, it won't matter. A social API, wow, by the time you got your response back from a Twitter API, there's going to be 100 new tweets that you could fetch. But
Right.
in average business level application, how long is this data valid for that business? You know, how long do you want to be able to keep that, and making decisions based on that context always makes sense.
So, do you think it makes sense to always, run behind something like a Cloudflare or some sort of HTTP cache CDN type
Yeah,
service?
100%. I mean, always run behind, you know, some level of kind of proxy of some description, whether that's Cloudflare or an API gateway, whatever it might be. It adds layers on top of your API, which helps to protect your API from, you know, potential DDoS attacks and potential kind of attackers to your API looking for vulnerabilities.
Sure. And like, do you think when you're talking about cache strategies, um, do you look at like explicit cache invalidation, like if you're behind a Cloudflare, are you ever looking at, okay, on my model saved event, I'm going to actually fire a cache invalidation request to Cloudflare to tell it to like invalidate a certain cache,
Yeah, I'd
even if
100% look
the
at doing that
expires
in certain
headers.
situations. Like certain situations, it makes a lot of sense to do that. But
Yeah.
it sounds like a bit of a kind of crap answer, but it depends. You know,
Sure.
business use case always dictates so many of the answers that we look for,
Yeah.
which is why we can never get the answers we actually want. But
Right.
general good practice. I'm going to cache as much as I can, and if I'm controlling cache through a proxy like Cloudflare, then I'm probably going to either, I know that every 6 hours I need to invalidate cache because of this business rule, or I only need to invalidate cache when this happens. Then I will trigger an API request or something off to Cloudflare to invalidate cache at certain points.
Yeah.
Otherwise, Cloudflare cache it until I tell you not to,
Right.
basically.
Yeah. I'm realizing now. I mean, I did a whole episode with Ian Landsman about caching. And one of the things that we talked about that I still am finding myself really gravitating towards is just like cache aggressively and invalidate even more aggressively.
Yes.
Like
Yeah.
I think that there's a lot of cases where I have definitely reached for just like, if anything changes, just flush the whole cache.
Yeah,
Like,
100%.
and
That's
then
kind of my typical approach is, in Laravel, for example, I'm going to get all of this data and I'm going to cache it every time. Don't care if I need to cache it or not. I'm going to cache it because it's going to speed it up. You know, a good API is going to respond fast, so the next person's going to have a faster response time. And then listen to those eloquent events and invalidate cache and have specific cache keys throughout your application. Typically, I maintain an enum in my Laravel application, which will have a list of cache keys. I've got an
mm,
enum for cache keys, and I just select which one when I'm, you know, when I'm working through it. And then if I need to add a new one, I add another case to my enum, and then I set that through it, and it just kind of keeps things organized. But then I know I can, to invalidate cache for this very specific thing. And then anyone else who's working with me, they know that there's this cache enum and they don't have to guess strings based on context. So,
yeah.
yeah.
Um, when you're caching API responses, are you caching sort of individual layers and then composing them together, or caching the final response? Right? Especially
I
when you're talking about nested resources like
Yeah,
um
so I will cache. Typically, I'll just cache like the result of a query. If I'm
okay.
doing something like something where I'm including sub resources, I will build up that cache string based
Mhm.
on the query. So,
Mhm.
um, you know, the chances of another person straight away requesting all projects, including, the project owner and the project lead, certain contexts, that's quite high. I'm Jira. People are going to be requesting that a lot because I've got a really crazy ass interface that's going to send too many requests. Um, so I can cache that quite often. Again, it depends. If your application is one of these applications that's a lot more kind of dynamic and fast, then you're going to want to have really drill down into those kind of potential cache keys and how you might name them. Is it faster to cache that entire response, or is it faster to cache part of the response and then kind of side load the other parts in afterwards? Do you want to look
Mhm.
at something like Vulkan by the people behind API platform, where you can actually send those resources after the fact, in which case you could
Mhm.
cache them as well. I can
Mhm.
cache what they've asked for. I know what else they've asked for, but I can send that afterwards using I think it's a 103 status. So it's like, you also asked for this. Here you go. I think it's early
Okay.
hints or something.
Yes. Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah. Yep.
so depending on what you're using and depending on your use case, there's so many ways you could be smart about caching your data, which is why
Yeah.
it's always such a hard topic. And anytime anyone asks me, what cache strategy would you take for this? It's like, well, it depends. What are you trying to do? What is your business goals? How often is this application used? And you can't just say, I don't know, 2 weeks. There you go. Cache it for 2 weeks. You'll be fine. You know, you
This is the
unfortunately you
exact
can't do
number of
that.
seconds. That's correct.
Yeah, exactly. Let me just get out my calculator for you. Um, caching strategy is it's as unique as business offerings. you
Sure.
know you've got to kind of match it to what you're offering at some point.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. Um, in terms of the API response, is it? I mean, is JSON schema or is that? Yeah, JSON schema is just like the standard format everyone
So,
uses
so
now.
Jason's schema is like a schema definition of what your response should look like. You're on about the JSON API specification, which is the format of the response. So you've got like, the ID, the type, and the attributes and the relationships all in a specific. This is how your response should look. Fill in your data.
Okay.
Um, I sometimes use that. Other times, more often I actually lean on HAL, which
On
is
what?
like a HAL, which is hypermedia. I can never remember what it stands for. Every time I say it, I just think of
Hypertext application language.
that's the one. Because
Okay.
for
I've
me,
never heard of
it feels
this.
like it leverages HTTP a little bit better. Um, but certain use cases, you want something like JSON LD, or you might want JSON API spec. So again, something I spoke about at my Laracon talk was specifications. I think I spoke for
Mhm.
like 10 minutes about it. It's like you could go for something like JSON API, and 80% of scenarios that would be perfect. But other situations, this is better. But as long as you're consistent, the specification is a little bit like the single responsibility principle. Yes, it's great in theory, but it doesn't fit every scenario.
Uh-huh. Yeah, okay, that's interesting. I mean, this is another one where I would have just assumed that one approach won out.
No,
um,
it's more about consistency over which standard. Like if you're going to use
okay.
a standard, embrace that standard.
So what's the what is it about HAL that speaks to you over the JSON API spec?
Um, I think I just like the way that you get embeds. I'm embedding this object over. This is my object with its attributes, and it just kind of feels more tailored towards HTTP. I'm building a HTTP API. I want to respond as hypertext. I don't want to respond as some kind of formed mess that's perfect for this specific React application. I want to
Mhm.
respond in a specific way, in a way that general HTTP tooling will kind of lean towards.
Interesting. Yeah, I'll have to look at it cuz I'm not particularly I've never heard of it before, so
It's a lot more
um
flexible than something like JSON API, but it's also a bit older. But I do
okay.
personally prefer it.
Um it's funny because I so I feel like this dates me, but I we have a standard API response at
Yeah,
InternetG, and it includes the HTTP status code because I remember a time when you weren't necessarily guaranteed at the JavaScript side to always get the HTTP response code
yeah,
in your response.
I remember those days.
Um, and I assume that that is not an issue anymore, and that's not
No,
common practice. But
no, I
um,
mean I still see so many APIs passing back the status code as part of the request body.
yeah,
Um, Personally, I can't stand it, and I know that we do it at Treble with some of our APIs. Um,
hmm
but I'm not in the engineering team, so there's only so picky I can be. But yeah, you don't need to repeat yourself.
right,
You know,
right. You've
okay,
already returned the status.
yeah, exactly. Oh, okay. If we're going to go that far, we may as well also, say, oh, this is actually JSON that you're consuming, and oh, it's also UTF-8. How
Yeah,
far down the line do you want to go? Do you want to repeat all of our headers in the payload as well?
yeah, yeah. I get that. I mean, I don't know that I feel less strongly about. I do. The other thing that we have in all of our standard responses is every response has an OK root level property that's just true
True or
false.
false? Oh no.
And I love it because it's just like no matter what you're doing,
Yeah,
you always just have one very terse, quick way to see like,
yeah.
is this a good outcome or a bad outcome? You know?
I suppose, but I mean, the status code will tell you that a lot of the time. But I do get it.
Oh, sure, it
Like, I
will.
mean, I'm speaking from a kind of I spend more time building than consuming APIs, so
Hmm.
you know, I'm going to have a slightly different opinion to someone who spends more time integrating with APIs. But
Sure.
to me, in my brain, I've given you the status code.
Yeah.
You know, I have given you a 202 or a 201. You know what that means. Let's carry on. Um,
Right.
but I suppose as someone who's more back end engineer, everything to me is a little bit more binary.
Sure.
It's very much kind of, yeah, it's a 201, you're fine. Or 202, we'll deal with it later. Um, it's, I'm very specific in my APIs for status codes. Like if I've created the object, yeah, I'll send the created response back. If I haven't created the object, but I've dispatched a background job, that could fail, but that's outside of the remit of that request response lifecycle because it's stateless. So I'll tell you that I've accepted your request. I haven't created
Hmm.
your resource because it's not in the database yet. If you instantly send another request, you're going to get a 404. So
Right.
have a 202. I will create it depending on how busy the queue is. You know,
Right. Yeah. That I mean, I fundamentally agree with that. I think, um, in my day to day, there's really only, I mean, honestly, there's really only 4 status codes that I ultimately ever really use.
I'm
That's not true
let's see if
when
I
I'm
can
getting,
guess them. 200,
yeah,
201.
nope,
You send a 200 on a create response. Damn it. Okay, so 200. I'm going to say that there is also 401 and 403.
that's true. You know what? You're right. Those are 2 others. Yep. I mean, yep. You've skipped 2, but
422, I'd say. You probably return that from a validation, unprocessable entity, and possibly a
mm,
400 for a bad request. Or worst case, you'll do a 405 because, someone's trying to request something from, a get request from a post endpoint. But,
right. Well,
framework
the
handles that.
the API will, I mean, the framework will do that for you,
Yeah.
right? And that's true. I mean, yeah, the framework will do a lot of the 400 level responses
Yeah.
kind of on your behalf. So those are ones that I don't necessarily think about. I was going to say 200, 301, 302, and 404. Those are the response codes that, like, I would say a typical backend Laravel app, because even on a create request to a Laravel app, that's usually going to result in a 302 response
Yeah, I mean,
redirect to the
it'll probably
created
redirect
resource.
if it's a web app, not a web API.
Yeah. So like 201,
Yeah.
maybe if you had pressed me, I would have been able to tell you what that was, but I don't know that I would. Uh, I very rarely have to think in status
Yeah.
codes other than, is this a permanent or non-permanent redirect? That's like the
Yeah, no.
thing, the only
I
status
One of
code that
my
I really
open
think
source
about.
packages is basically just a really big PHP enum with all the different status codes, um, which
Like with their names.
yeah, literally with their names. And I've also added doc blocks with like links to the references of them in the, I think it was in the Mozilla docs. It's like, so if you
Hmm.
want to know about this, you can click, you can literally from your IDE click through to the Mozilla docs based on what response code you're giving back in your controller.
That's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. Those are, I mean, I think that all of those are constants on the response object in Laravel too, but I don't know if they have references to the docs. They probably don't.
They are like, I mean, they kind of extend the symphony response, so they are part of a symphony response. They are
Yeah.
constants on there, and I believe it does have most, if not all of them. And I'm not 100% sure if they've got doc links.
Yeah.
I built it because I also use it in like some of my other packages which are outside of the framework, like my PHP SDK library, which is like a framework for building SDKs in PHP.
Oh,
Having
interesting.
status codes within there is great, but I'm not pulling in Symfony. I'm not pulling in Laravel stuff, so I needed a way to be able to kind of use that where I need it.
Hmm. That's such an interesting, that's such an interesting space. It's the type of thing that feels like it should be solvable, but I'm not certain that it is. The like, is there a way to provide like generic SDK tooling
Yes,
for
I
just
solved
anybody? Hmm?
that. I created
Sure,
a
you did.
package for that.
as
I-
as has everyone else, though.
exactly. Everybody solved it. What are you on about? No, I found a way that works for me, and it kind of leverages, you know, PSRs and you know RESTful standards. Basically, is the idea behind it.
You see, that's the problem, though. Is in my experience, as a primarily backend developer, I can tell you immediately with absolute certainty, is this SDK tailor made, or is it built on top of something else that's just like following some sort of standard? Because like when I'm consuming an SDK, I want it to feel perfectly fluent and absolutely tailored
Yeah.
to the domain of the thing that I'm working with. I don't want to be thinking in, HTTP verbs or,
Yeah.
you know, cruddy terms. I want to just
Exactly.
say,
Yeah.
do the thing that this does. You know what I mean?
And that's what
And
I
like,
aimed for with my kind of SDK package was that, I basically just wrapped up the whole kind of transport and building layer. And then, I basically give abstract classes and traits and say, okay, build your SDK like that, include the traits where you need them, and build the API you need with this set of tools
mhm,
for your package and your SDK. And for me, it's worked. I've used it in several places. I built the Laravel and Voya PHP SDK with it, and it seems to be working okay.
mhm,
I haven't had any complaints, and it's got like 78,000 downloads. So I must have done something right. Either that or it was
sure.
downloaded a lot and never used. Stats are stats.
Yeah. I mean, I'm gonna take a look because I constantly think like, it feels like this should be a solved problem, but every time I go about it, I was just recently I recently was tinkering with building a linear SDK for PHP because there really
Nice.
isn't. There are a couple attempts, but none of them feel
Isn't it a
great to me.
GraphQL API as well?
It is a GraphQL API,
That's what
which,
stopped me doing it, I think, because I use Linear a
yeah.
lot as well.
Well, I'll send you the link afterwards. It's an interesting project.
Nice.
Um,
Yeah, I'll definitely check it out.
talk. I mean, talk about the one upside of GraphQL in this use case is, um, it's very the spec. I mean, the introspection stuff gives you a lot of flexibility,
Yeah.
and so in the case of Linear's API, I was able to do kind of this crazy transformation where I parse the GraphQL, um, the GraphQL file from linear
Yeah.
into an AST, and then I transform the AST from the GraphQL tree to a PHP parser tree,
Yeah.
so that and then render that AST to code. So ultimately, in a single execution, I am able to auto generate classes that exist for every single entity in the linear
Yeah.
API.
See,
With
that
full
stuff is cool.
100%
I
type
mean, you could
coverage.
do the same with an Open API spec, though, in reality. And, people do it, but it's not as easy.
Yeah, I mean, if there's a really good Open API parser that gives you something to walk, a tree to walk. But I definitely know. I mean, I'm trying to think of. There are a couple of SDKs that I use that, like, that they're auto generated from a spec file somewhere,
Yeah.
and it feels like it. You open up, you go into the code, and everything is
Twilio is a
just like,
perfect example.
huh?
Twilio was a
Twilio?
perfect example. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I'm blanking out on the one that there's one that I deal with all the time that every time I source dive, I'm just like, none of
Yeah.
this means anything.
This
It's
was released
all
last week and it's using PHP 4 features. What's going on?
right,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, but it's an interesting space. It's an interesting
Oh,
space.
definitely.
All right,
I
what's
do
yeah,
some freelance work for a company called Speakeasy who do SDK generation. And
okay,
the way they've approached it is they've basically built like an AST template engine for each language that they generate to, so that they'll pass an
Okay.
open API spec, and then they'll build out an SDK based on the template, and that template can change. So something new gets introduced, or they find a better way to do something, they'll build it out slightly differently. Um, I've done some consulting on how their PHP generation should work and that sort of stuff, and their SDKs are the better of the generated ones that I've seen.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I mean it's definitely a balance because if you don't have unlimited money and you want to provide an SDK for a bunch of different languages, you have to
Yeah,
accept it. So, I'm not
100%.
knocking companies for doing it. I do think
I,
that the big
I,
companies, Twilio
yeah,
could afford to have just a sole PHP developer working on their SDK.
yeah,
Um, and it'd probably be better than
yeah,
the auto-generated
100%.
BS, right?
Yeah. I mean, if I had to write a Java SDK or yeah, a .NET Core SDK, then I'd probably think about a different line of work. So yeah, there's times when
Right.
auto generation makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I know something that do you know Daniel Colburn at
Yeah,
all? Or I know Daniel and Thunk, one of the things that they have been doing is trying to work with medium-sized groups to provide just like we'll make
yeah,
just an exceptional Laravel SDK for your product. You know what I mean? And I think that's a really interesting space. Like there's so many places where, um, yeah, it's just like if you don't understand the ecosystem, you're not gonna
you
get
got
it right. You know, so just having someone within that space write the code um, makes such a big difference.
yeah. I mean, especially from a developer experience perspective, and I had a really good chat with the head of developer experience at Paddle not that long ago, and the amount of effort they put into handwriting their SDKs off of a set of practices and principles is it's really admirable that companies will still do that.
Yeah, for sure. All right. We've been going for a long time. I have one last question for you, which is, how often do you use the 418 response code?
I use it so much actually.
Do you?
Yeah, I do it for fun. If it's like I'm not sure what I should respond here, then 418.
Might as well be a teapot.
Exactly. If you're not sure, and if all else fails, a teapot will save the day. You're returning
I
something,
love that. I love that.
definitely.
So is there you know, I guess let's close out with the standard how do folks find you on the internet? Where's the best place to get connected with you?
I am, Twitter, X, whatever Elon's going to call it next. I'm, at Just Steve King. Same on GitHub, same on Mastodon, same on Blue Sky, Threads, all of the places I'm at Just Steve King. So
Okay. And is there anything that you've got going on right now that you'd like to plug? Any
so
particular thing
much,
that you're working on for people to check out or
so much. I mean, I'm doing so much through work at the moment, and next week I'm actually in Croatia for the whole week, recording a Laravel API video course.
Oh wow. Well, there you
Um,
go.
I've been meaning to do it for years, and I've been saying I'll do it for years. I finally put a date on it and said I'm going to do it within this window. And work are flying me out to the office in Croatia. They're setting up the recording studio, and they're literally going to spend the week with me recording this video course, and it's going to be free.
That's very cool.
So
That's awesome.
it's completely free. I think it's going to be behind some sort of sign up thing so you can track your progress, but nice free API video
Okay.
course.
Where will folks go to find that, or is there some place to sign up for updates or anything
It's,
like that yet?
I haven't gotten that bit built yet. I've been too busy. I like decided I was going to do it 2 weeks ago. Um,
Oh wow.
yeah, I mean, I've been planning it for years, but I only kind of decided to pull the trigger on it like 2 weeks ago. So I still need to,
Okay.
get a website and all that up for it. But if you keep an eye on the Treble Twitter, which is Treble API, all one word, um,
Okay. How do you spell
will
that?
will be, that will be Treble.
Okay.
I'll drop it in the chat. It's a funny spelling.
Sure. I'll include it in the show notes for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
it'll be
And I
announced through
assume you'll
there.
talk about it on Twitter as well. So
Yeah, obviously I'll talk about it on Twitter, but if you don't want to follow me, then just keep an eye on their Twitter.
okay. And you do a lot of YouTube live streaming too, right?
Yeah, I try to live stream at least once or twice a week. More recently, I've
Okay.
been doing kind of 3 times a week for 2 hours at a time.
Wow. Okay. So that's another place to check out, and I'll throw that in the
Yeah,
show notes as well.
thank you.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining, and
Thanks for having me.
yeah, I'm interested. I'm going to keep a eye out for this API course because it's definitely one of those things. Even though I don't have to do it that often, um, I often wonder about some of those best practices. So that sounds really
Yeah.
interesting.
If you haven't done it in a while, it's nice to refresh your memory on it. And if you do it often, it's nice just to kind of see how other people approach it in case there's a different way.
For
And,
sure.
low barrier of entry, all we're going to require is a way to sign up, no cost. So no matter where you're from, no matter what your budget is, you'll be able to learn.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks again. Until next time.
Thank you very much.